I see Marvin Suter is here, so be careful, hold your ears. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
That's his trademark. Welcome to the Pana History Museum. I really appreciate you guys coming. We had a full crowd for the 2 o'clock show and a good crowd for the 4 o'clock show, and we just really appreciate you coming. A little history on the museum. This building, I got it in 2004, and it was in really poor shape. And all the coffee drinkers at McDonald's said that guy's nuts, and they were right. It was a project. But my father and I, one brick, one window, one door at a time, we just kind of fixed the place up. We didn't add anything. We tried to take the cove molding down and put it back up and restore it rather than remodel. So that's what we did. And I retired from an engineering company in St. Louis about probably 15 years ago. And I decided I was going to open up a little cafe here. So I was open for 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. That's 15 hours. That turned into 60 hours a week, at 80 hours a week by the time you got here and cooked the food and cleaned up afterwards. But Dave Nance was a teacher at the high school, and Dave would come in here and eat lunch every single day. And I said to Dave, you know, I'd like to put a couple of old painted pictures on the wall. And it just kind of got out of hand. Now we have probably 5,000 pictures in the museum and artifacts, and we bring classes, the school classes through, and it's just been it's been a blessing. It's like it was destiny, you know, that Pana needed a museum and this building needed restored, and it all just kind of came together. And if you haven't been through the museum, make sure you walk through it after this presentation. But John Meacham and Judy Hill Green have been researching and finding out about this Pana bank robbery from 1934. And they got away with a lot of money, and it never was solved. And what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of rehash everything, all the research they've done, and we're going to have a jury, and we're going to determine whether maybe the notorious John Dillinger was the guy or not, or at least planned it. So without further ado, I want to introduce John Meacham, the man that does all the research and that will be taking care of this presentation. Thank you, John.
Great crowd, I'm happy to see it. This is a first in what we hope to be a series of presentations about Pana history, and to put a plug in for the next one, I think around Labor Day weekend we're going to do one on Stone Cold Settlement, which was the settlement south of Pana. Some people call it the first Pana, and then the coming of the railroads to the Pana area and the formation and founding of Pana. So keep your eyes open for that one, and again, we thank you very much for attending. Now, you thought you were coming to a history presentation, and you sort of are, but you're also attending a mystery, because in 1934, April 19th, the Pana First National Bank was robbed of some $27,000. That's about $600,000 today. So it was a pretty big deal. What we are going to do is we're going to reopen that case. And the reason is because no one was ever tried for the case. No one was ever convicted of doing the robbery. So it is a 90-year-old cold case, and that's what we're going to look at today. Now, as Mike said, and I think it's true, my name is John Meacham. Grew up in Pana, class of 73, and I see a lot of the other class of 73 out there. Yes, I am another one of Pana's prodigal sons that is returning to Pana after years apart from the town. I'd like to recognize a few people before we get started. One is Judy. She is the co-author of the upcoming book called The 1934 Pana Bank Robbery, The Shadow of Dillinger. Judy's graduated 1973 as well. I think it's been scientifically proven that the class of 73 is where all the women are strong, the men good looking, and the presentations are above average. Judy's helped with the research, she helped write, edited, and she consistently laughed at my flailing attempts to type. She's the presentation coordinator, so a lot of what you see here today is thanks to her, and she organized the Dillinger games, who you see walking around in the flapper outfits. Now, I'd like to also thank Mike, standing over there. See him, he's trying to look inconspicuous, but Mike is responsible for audio-visual coordination today. Mike has been cursed with the task of trying to bring a number of mid-20th century people into the technology age of the 21st century. His efforts have been long and sometimes successful. He had a full head of hair, though, when this began. So Mike put together the audio-visual part of the presentation, far beyond those who still think that postcards are a wonder of modern technology. Most of all, and I say this last, but really the first among us to work on this project is Mike Cross. He has almost single-handedly helped collect and preserve Pana history over the last 20 years. The Pana History Museum is a product of the work and money that Mike put into this effort. And I hope you've toured the museum. If you haven't had a chance to do it before this presentation, there will be a time afterwards you can do it. Mike has been the heart and soul of Pana history for a number of years. And thank you, Mike, for all the work you've done and for hosting this presentation today. You may ask, why this presentation? Well, there's a number of things. The first is, it's for the love of Pana history. It's what made it possible for it to be produced and what's brought you here today. It's something we all share. The other reason for it is we want to share with you fascinating stories about the history of Pana. Pana has an incredible history for a town of its size, and we think that a lot of that has been neglected over the years, so we're going to try to bring that to light. The third thing is we want to showcase the museum. We want to have people recognize its unique value to the community and to help support it. So that's kind of why we're here. The presentation is free, but please consider making a donation to help support your best connection to Pana history. We'd like to, we are working on the audio visuals, you can tell, so this is someone that we're going to bring forward some of the jury members. And I subpoenaed some jury members to attend here today, and one is Richard Smith. Now, you all know Rick, he's been around town for a long time. He was selected to be one of the jurors because his grandfather actually worked at the bank and was involved in robbery. Now, I've been a witness to a number of the criminal acts that Richard has been involved with in his youth, and I can attest to him being well suited to recognize criminality when he sees it. What you see here is, you may not know this, but he was a co-founder of the Lithuanian Liberation Army. He's half Lithuanian, and he's pictured here today with an unknown Lithuanian Liberation Army soldier. So, Richard, if you would come forward and sit in the jury box, we would really appreciate it.
Not only a witness, but a co-conspirator.
Jury box.
That other person.
That ain't gonna fit.
That's good though. Do you have a packet that might help you?
Oh, I did.
We need a bailiff here, I think. Another person is Jay Denton. Jay's aunt, Helen Eilers, worked in the bank and was a witness to the robbery. This is Jay when he was vice president of the advertising department back in about 1973.
Okay.
Jay, if you would come forward. John, where are you? John, do you have a package? We would like for you to come down. We had, after hours of research, we determined that the John Metzger, who was a witness to the bank robbery, is related to John Metzger. You can tell us the crack research the way I did this project. Now, does anyone else want to volunteer to be a juror? It's not much work.
How much pay?
Your only responsibility is to listen and to fill out an unofficial jury sheet, as you see right there. We've listed some of the prime suspects in here. So all I have to do is listen and then check the box. Anyone else want to do it? Don't make me subpoena you.
I'll do it.
There you go. Would you introduce yourself as a juror?
Marla Craven.
Marla Craven. She's a we'll use 4. That's about all we'll fit here. Now, didn't know you were also involved in a costume show there, did you? I don't tell anyone about this at the 4 o'clock show where they may not show up.
Marla is Rhonda Wofford's sister.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so, next slide, please. Now we're going to do it for. Now, there were 2 banks in Pana, the Pana National Bank and the Skyler Bank you see here. You see postcards of that, so it's around a lot. Both of these banks failed in 1930 in the depths of the Great Depression. There was a period of time when Pana did not have a bank at all. And you can imagine how difficult that made it for people to cash checks and businesses to transact their business. Now, what happened was 2 men. One was Warren Penwell. Warren Penwell was one of the co-founders of the First National Bank of Pana, president of Penwell Coal Company, and a former mayor of Pana. He and Mr. Winfield B. Jordan, who was the editor of the Pana Palladium, formed the First National Bank. And that was that actual picture of the First National Bank. Now, there are probably people here today who recognize or know what the First National Bank of Pana looked like and say, well, that doesn't look like the bank. It expanded in 1940 to the form that people that probably are more familiar with. But that said, it was a very successful bank, even in the midst of the Great Depression. In March of 1934, it had almost $650,000 in cash and government securities. It was a mainstay of the Pana economy. Next. Now, you may not know it, but the Depression era was the golden era of bank robbery. Bank robbery doesn't happen much today because it's very hard to successfully rob a bank. Modern technologies made that impossible. But back in the 1930s, there were a number of famous bank robbers. This is Ma Barker. The next is Alvin Creepy Harpus. And when you look at that picture, you can see he was well named. And then George Babyface Nelson, another famous person. He was actually a part of the Dillinger gang, off and on. A very violent person. Now, the one that probably almost everyone has heard of is Bonnie and Clyde. There's been 10 movies made about these two. Last was The Highwaymen, made in 2019. But the king of them all, was John Dillinger. He had celebrity status during the Great Depression. There was rampant unemployment, people were frightened and felt helpless, and Americans have always been drawn to the anti-hero, and people like Dillinger, believe it or not, were considered a hero by many. One of the reasons is they robbed banks, and banks in the Depression were oftentimes seen as villains. They had loaned a lot of money in the 1920s when the economy was roaring great, but when the Depression came, they had to foreclose, and those foreclosures were extremely unpopular and made them villains in the eyes of many, and people who robbed from them accepted as anti-heroes. Now, Pana may have been a little different in that regard because it had gone that 6-month period without a bank, and they knew how important the bank was to the community. So they may not look very kindly upon bank robbers. Now, this is a very important car. This is what the getaway car used by the robbers in the First National Bank robbery used. This train, this car, was initially seen at the Taylorville Depot on the night of April 18th. It was parked there with a second car. So you can see it's a dark blue Pontiac sedan, 1930. The other car was not specifically named, but I would wager it was a Chevrolet. Had the Taylorville police had the equipment that we have today and they ran the license plates on this, they would have found out something very interesting about this car. It had been stolen on the 17th in Danville, Illinois. The license plates on it had been stolen on Wednesday night, April 18th, in Litchfield for a car that was owned in Gillespie. So this was the getaway car. License plate number 61722 shows up repeatedly in the narrative of what happened in the robbery. On the morning of the 19th at about 7, that car was seen at the Kirkpatrick gas station, which was at the corner of Cedar and Jackson. Now, I don't know if any of you remember that building. I seem to, so I don't know it's that much removed from being history. But Charlie Kirkpatrick was the attendant of the gas station. Now, to some of the younger people in the crowd, this may sound unbelievable to you, but at that time, gas station attendants would come out and ask you how much gas you wanted. They would put the gas in your car, and in the meantime, wash your windows and check your oil if you wanted. Much different now, obviously. Well, he said he saw this car. It was mud besplattered, is what he called it, and it looked like it had been driven all night, and he said it was dew covered, which implied that it had sat somewhere that night. It's turned out it was sitting table. There were two men in the car, one 26 years old, about 160 pounds, and wearing a light suit and hat. The other man was about 35 years old, 150 pounds, dark clothes. There was at least one traveling bag in the back seat. Now, he didn't say what was in it. In fact, Charlie didn't know what was in it, but I would speculate it probably contained Tommy guns, machine guns like this. They would not carry this into a bank because obviously they wanted to enter the bank without being conspicuous. They'd have pistols, but to shoot out, they would have these in the back seat in case there was any kind of pursuit. Now, there was the interesting thing is Charlie said these two looked manifestly nervous. And he was a little suspicious, and he had someone inside the bank write down the license plate number, which was 617722. But he wasn't suspicious enough to call the police. He just kind of noted it and had that down. There was a second car seen that day, early in the morning, out by the West Cemetery on the west side. It was a new Chevrolet parked there about a mile west of Pana, as many of you know. And there was a man standing outside the car that looked nervous. Again, no police call, but it was noted. Now, let's see here. Now, oops. Now, to help you visualize where everything is at, this is, we marked some of the buildings that you're going to hear about as we discuss this. First is the First National Bank. Now, it is right there. It's unfortunately has been torn down. Very impressive bank. I remember going in it to play pool. Some people would say that was the right transition for a bank to become a pool hall. Another thing that's important is Lee's Waffle House. Now, you might remember where Whitey's Pool Hall was. The back of that building at this time, 1934, was a Waffle House. There was also a jewelry store on the other side of that alley that separated where the bank was from that row of buildings on East 2nd Street. That was Butterfield's Jewelry. That's another important place in this county ride. And then over here, which is about across from where the bank was in this area, that is the Central Barber Shop. There we go.
See the map, we have 3 on the wall over here, and then 1 over on the counter. You can't see that far.
Yeah, that'll help you. Perhaps that'll help you see it. And the last but not least is Gallagher's Electric Shop. That was here in what once was Barber's and the music store in that area. Those all play a role in what happened during the robbery. So, 2 men had been in, let's put that back. Yeah, let's put it right place. 2 men had been in the Waffle Shop that morning. And those 2 men had been seen in the Waffle House a number of mornings before the robbery, just walking up and down the alley and looking things over. As it turns out, those 2 were scouts for the bank robbery. They were casing vigilant, as it might be called. They studied things very closely. They knew the bank routines. They watched for the regular employees and when they arrived and what their responsibilities were. When the Pontiac arrived with the now four men in it, they picked up the other 2 men somewhere. One was a lookout, and he was stationed in front of the Central Barber Shop. The other robber stayed in the car. He never left the car, kept his head down, kept the engine running. Then 2 robbers exited the car, and they walked down that alley that was on the north side of the bank. I remember that. And there they encountered Rick's grandfather. He was washing the windows on the north side of the bank. They accosted him, showed him the pistol, and forced him to walk to the back of the bank and open the back door. The robbers that were doing this were described as between 28 and 30. One was about 5'8" and weighed about 165. His companion was older, 50 or 60 years old. He was not heavy, but he was described as very red-faced. Now, Mr. Smith was standing on a ladder. They made him get off the ladder, and there were some reports that they actually hit him, but I tend not to believe that because they would not want to make a scene outside the bank and have anyone see it from Gallagher's or wherever. So they took him into the bank. One more forward here. Oh, I'm sorry, that's right. This is basically what the layout of the bank was like. They came in the back door here. One of them stood back here in the back and locked the back door. The other one walked Mr. Schmitz to the lobby, had him sit out there and read a newspaper. I guess that was to make it look like everything was normal. although I'm not sure why Rick's grandfather would be reading a newspaper inside the lobby of the bank unless they decided he wasn't a very diligent janitor at 8 in the morning. I should say this was at about 7:50 in the morning. What they were doing then was they were waiting for the employees to appear. Now, there were two guys, Mr. Butterfield and Mr. Kuhn, who were in Butterfield's store, which is here. This is at the south end of the Spartan building. Now, many of you know where George's was at. It's that building where there was later, I remember being a shoe repair place, but that's where his jewelry store is at. They saw the car come up. They saw the 4 men in the car, and for some reason that made them suspicious because they had been reading about bank robberies in the area. And they speculated that someone would pull that stunt, as they called it, here at the bank. So they were suspicious, but they weren't, again, suspicious enough to do anything about it. They just sat and kind of watched. They didn't even see these guys get out of the car. All they saw was a suspicious car with 4 people in it, discussed it, and while they were discussing it, 3 people left the car. So what happened next is, these are the employees of the bank. They arrived one by one. The robbers kind of knew their routine and expected who was going to be there. The first was Daisy Dean Underwood, bookkeeper. Mr. Schmitz unlocked the front door for her to allow her to come in, but when she did, the robbers stepped up with a gun and told her to keep her hands down because she kind of automatically put her hands up. He said, "You don't want to tip anyone off what's going on." And he walked her then to the back of the bank where there was a cloakroom, and the other robber walked her into that room and told her to sit down in a chair that was there. Helen Eilers was next. She's a teller, came to the door, escorted to the back. She was then placed in the same cloakroom, sat in a chair. Miss Kathleen Johnston was next. Same thing happened. Now, all of these people say that the robbers were very calm, very polite, very respectful. One was even cheerful, said to Miss Johnson, "Good morning," to which she replied, "Good morning," and they shook hands. That shows you what's going on. I mean, this wasn't like a violent episode at all. They were firm, and they wanted to control the situation, so that the people coming into the bank knew they were armed, but they weren't overtly threatening, with a few exceptions. The cheerful bandit took Miss Johnson back, sat her in the cloakroom, and held her there. Then the cashier, Walter Kerr, arrived. So they had these people sitting there. The bank vault, had 2 doors. It had a major door here that was timed. It was timed to open at 8 o'clock, and the robbers knew that. So they waited in the cloakroom area until that vault door opened. They then took Walter Kerr to that door, you see there, that was the second door of the bank, and told him to open it. He initially said he didn't know how to open it, and they said, "Oh no, you know how. We've watched you open that door." And that shows the level of surveillance that they had put into knowing the routines of the bank. Mr. Kerr was a little bit nervous. He said, I've never opened this with a gun in my back, so I hope I can do it." And he did. At that point, it's a little after 8 o'clock, they, at that point, checked that inner door. They checked that inner door to see if there were any wires attached to it, to see if there was a burglar alarm. So they knew enough about banks in general and bank robbery and security in banks to check that. So they got inside, and what they did is they had 2 satchels, and they just went in and they took money that was readily available from the cash drawers and what they call the reserve that was used in the normal course of business, poured that into the satchels that they had. They even took 4 cents out of one of the drawers to show how thorough they were. There was more money in the bank. There's about $75,000 in all, but they were working on a timing system. They were only going to be inside that vault no more than 5 or 10 minutes. That way, whatever they could get, they would get. What they couldn't get, they couldn't get. But the lookout and the driver, they all knew at about 10 after 8, those guys are going to come out of the bank. So they got the money. They asked, where is Mr. Clark? He was another teller. And they said, well, he stayed up late last night and he didn't show up. It didn't say why he showed up late. I'd kind of like to know, but they also then asked where the other girl is. There was another teller that hadn't arrived yet, and they knew she hadn't arrived. But what happened was they took the people that were there, put them back in the cloakroom, and said, stay here for 5 minutes, we're going to leave. They then exited the back of the bank, and as they did, who should appear but Miss Roachus. Sue Roachus approached the door as they were opening the back of the bank. She was startled to see them, and they were probably startled to see her, and they grabbed her, pulled her in, put her in the cloakroom, and again said, stay in here 5 minutes. They came out of the bank here, and they started down the alley. Now, go to the next slide, please. Some of you may remember this alley. This is the alley they went down. That's where Butterfield's was at, what we call the George's building. You can barely see the bank right here, but you can see it was just narrow enough for one car to go down. Now, you may ask why we have that picture. In 1976, for some reason, some historical bug bit me, and I went around town and photographed different things, and for some reason I photographed that. But that is the alley. Now, the time was up. The outside lookout and the driver knew that they were going to come out of the alley. So the car that was parked in front of the First National Bank pulled into the alley. Now, it's unclear why he did that. He might have done it with the intent of driving down here, picking them up, or he might have just drived in there so when they came out carrying satchels, they would be doing it in the alley and instead of in front of the bank. But when this happened, they were confronted with the surprise because a truck, the garbage truck, had pulled into the alley. Now, the driver and the occupant of the garbage truck, that's what it was, they thought they saw the lookout and the driver in the front seat of the getaway car and thought they knew them, thought they were local Pana people. They were going to give them a scare and run up in their truck to the front of the car until they realized they didn't know who they were, and they just kind of sheepishly waved, and the 2 guys in the car kind of waved back, and they just sat there. In the meantime, the 2 men who were inside the bank with their satchels ran by the truck and got in the back of the getaway car. And at that point, the truck driver said, I think this is a robbery, and they were right. Mr. Butterfield and Mr. Kuhn, who were in the jewelry store there, they also saw these guys run across the street and run down here to get in the car. And at that point, they realized it was robbery. Now, it's important to note that, although they may have seen these people before, they didn't really note them as robbers. It wasn't, it was just kind of interesting, but it wasn't something they were really paying attention to. And then what happened in front of the bank and in front of the jewelry store right in here, all of a sudden, a whole lot of stuff started happening that was confusing and startling. As it turned out, of the 4 people, John Metzger, who had been walking down here and was stopped by the car pulling in, the 2 guys in the truck, the 2 guys there, 5 people in all. Of those people, only Mr. Butterfield had a good look at the faces of the 2 robbers getting in the car and the lookout. And that's might surprise you, but you know, it's a phenomena of the way the human mind operates when it's confronted with a lot of things all happening at once. Sometimes people will only focus on one thing. And Mr. Butterfield was the only person to focus on the faces of the people in the car, and in particular, the lookout. The lookout he described as having as a decided limp. That's very important. The other thing he said about him was that, you know, he saw his face. Again, that's important. The car then backed out of the alley, went down to 2nd Street, made a left-hand turn, and as he said, roared out of town. The two guys that were in the garbage truck, they understood that there was a robbery. They ran to the back of the bank, which had been left unlocked by robbers, freed the employees, or at least told them they could leave. And then Mr. Bradley, who was one of the truck drivers, ran down this alley to where City Hall was at, then as now, to alert the police. Opinion Chief of Police William McGinley and Deputy Sheriff were soon at the scene. They had told trucks to go and block all the entrances and exits out of Pana. By then, the robbers were already gone. There was a state policeman in town, Charles Budd. Now, I say state police. That's not what they were called until later. They were called like highway patrol. But they just started being involved in investigating crimes. Mr. Budd was here, and he drove as far as Olin, right there, and never caught up with him. And no one in Olin said that they'd ever seen him. They were all chasing this Pontiac. Now, today, there are ways that the police broadcast all over the state that a crime's been committed, say what the license plate number was, say what the car looked like, describe the men inside the car. That did not exist in 1934. There was no way that even the state police could alert all of the other state police department that a crime had been committed and look for this blue Pontiac. There was something like 200 patrolmen on duty at that time, but no one knew about it. They probably didn't know about it until they reported back into their stations. What the police speculated that happened was that they drove out of Pana. Some thought they drove just a little bit north to Bear Creek Road, took that up to Taylorville. Some speculated they had already gone through Ullman and Nokomis and were headed that direction. There was a report that they went to the west side of Pana. Some say to where, if you remember where the greenhouse was between, there's a road between Circle Tavern and the greenhouse, they might have taken that. And there was a report that they went to the West Cemetery and turned left or south on that road on the west side of the cemetery. Whether they went south, west, north, there was a report that they went down the highway towards Taylorville. Someone said they saw a car with 5 people in it, at the Pontiac description, on Route 48 outside of Taylorville. But essentially, the car had disappeared, and it was never located. It's probably sitting now at the bottom of a pond in the river somewhere. They probably had a second car. They stashed the Pontiac, got another car, and took off. Now, the state investigators arrived there in the afternoon, and they did an initial review of what had happened. The interesting thing to me is the bank opened at 9 a.m. when they had no, so all the employees were there, all the customers were there, all of the people just curious to see what happened. They were all in the bank, and of course, none of them wore gloves. They were touching everything that was in the bank. When the state police arrived, they did look for fingerprints, but there were none that they could find that were recognizable, because by the time they arrived, the crime scene had been thoroughly contaminated. But what they did say was that the bank robbery had been pulled off in a very, very professional way. They said it was carefully planned, which it obviously was, because they knew basically how the bank operated. They said they had extraordinary knowledge of the actions and schedules of the employees, which they did, because they knew how they arrived and about when they were going to arrive. Said it was well planned, lasted about 20 minutes, smooth working, operated with precision, and it was performed like clockwork. They said it was obviously done with boldness and precision, and it must have been accomplished by criminal experts, is what they call them. And that, in fact, is true. When you look at the way that the robbery was conducted, it was done with precision. It wasn't just people running inside the bank with guns and saying, stick them up and open the cash drawers. They had planned it out in great detail. Now, the first thing that happened was people said it must be John Dillinger, because John Dillinger was probably the most famous bank robber at the time. Now, Dillinger had dominated headlines from his release from prison in 1933 when he went through a string of bank robberies. There were 12 bank robberies in that time that people knew he was involved with, but in all there were 22 performed by what was called the Dillinger Gang, and he might have been involved or planned some of those as well. Let's see, if we go to... So this is the person that was in charge of the investigation. His name is John W. Cole, and he was the Christian County State's Attorney. Now, it was a very interesting way that this investigation was conducted. In 1934, up until May 19th, bank robberies were not a federal crime. They are today. But it was not at the time the Pana bank robbery occurred. It was a state violation. So the FBI wasn't involved. It was state investigators who were investigating the case. The state police had only been doing this since the late 1920s. So they had some experience with crime investigation, but you can't say they had the crime expertise that the FBI had. Let's see, go to the next one. Now, there were a lot of witnesses to this crime, as you can see from this list in the handout. 18 known witnesses, but the witnesses were kind of divided up. There were those witnesses in the first, I could call them the outside witnesses. They witnessed what happened outside the bank at various times. I'm sorry? Oh, okay, I'm trying to get this thing closer. Can anyone turn this up? Mike, can this go any louder? Yeah, I can hold it real close. I tend to use my hands though, so we'll see if we can do some technical expertise here. There were 18 robbers. You can see here that most of them saw things outside the bank. They didn't see what was going on inside the bank. And then there were the employees who were inside the bank, and they saw nothing of what was going on outside the bank. So you have 4 robbers, 2 inside and 2 outside. There are distinct groups of witnesses that saw each, but no one saw everything. And that made the investigation difficult because they're going to have to paste together witness statements to try to figure out what happened and who did it. There was no physical evidence. They didn't have the car, they didn't have fingerprints, they didn't have the guns that were used, never were able to trace the money. So the entire case rested upon eyewitness testimony. Now, eyewitness testimony is some of the most, well, I won't say weak, it's some of the most difficult to pin down because the human mind does not remember things well. We see something and we first have to see it, then we have to understand it, then we have to record it in our minds, and then we have to keep it in our minds, and then we have to be able to tell people what we saw, or what we remember we saw. And the problem is the human mind quickly starts to dump information. It's kind of like your computer. It has a limited memory, and it'll start pushing out the things that it doesn't think important. So when the state police arrived, they had what they called a rogues gallery, which was a picture of all the people that they thought were criminals in the state and who could have been involved in the bank robbery. None of the witnesses identified any of the pictures that were in the rogues gallery except one. Now, we don't know who was in that rogues gallery. Judy and I went to Springfield a number of times. We went to Taylorville. We looked for the investigative file or the case file about this robbery, and it was nowhere to be found. So we don't know exactly what was in the rogues gallery. We don't know the pictures that were looked at, but we do know this. John Dillinger's picture was in that book, and Mr. Butterfield in the jewelry store next door said, "I think it was Dillinger. I recognized the face," and he limped across the street. So you would think that that would cause the state police to want to focus on Mr. Dillinger, but they didn't for some reason. They thought it was absurd to think Dillinger had robbed the bank, and the reason they thought that was because they didn't think it was done in Dillinger's style. Dillinger was a very flamboyant man, very athletic man. He was known to jump over the bank counters and do things like that. He was a very bold man. And these bank robbers were not like that. They were very controlled, very organized, very planned. But the state investigators either didn't believe or didn't see that Dillinger, in fact, planned out a lot of these robberies in advance. Very detailed, very specifically oriented towards a successful and nonviolent confrontation with the bank employees. It worked a number of times. He learned what's called the Lamb technique of bank robbery when he was in prison, released in 1933. This said, you use 4 robbers, 1 driver, 1 lookout, 2 in the bank, you scout in advance, you go in, control the employees, do your business in a set time period, and get out of the bank. He even had what he called plan out gets, which is get out of town, to have planned escape routes and planned alternate escape routes. One thing that always interested me about this is, did they know the schedule of trains? Because as you know, they went west on 2nd Street and they had to cross the Illinois Central. And at that time, the Illinois Central was very busy with the coal mines that were all there. Either they knew that it was safe to leave at that time because there wouldn't be a train, or they took that chance, but they made it out of town. Now, the limping lookout, that limp was considered what the police called identification. Mr. Butterfield had said he recognized the face as that of Dillinger from the pictures he was shown. Now, they didn't believe him. Apparently, they didn't believe him because they didn't take it seriously, said it was absurd for Dillinger to have been involved. The interesting thing is, while they didn't believe it was Dillinger, they did believe that the lookout had a limp. Now, you would think that if they weren't going to believe part, they wouldn't believe all. But they believed the lookout did, in fact, have a limp. It was the fact that it wasn't done in Dillinger's style that caused the state police, I think wrongly, to assume it couldn't be Dillinger because they thought that's not the way Dillinger robbed banks. Now, what they did do is they first identified a suspect. That was this guy, Roy Gann, who was at that time considered Pana's bad man. And he was a bad man. He was born in Arkansas, but his family lived in the Pana area. And he was running from the law. He was started out as a barber before he turned to a life of crime. But he was described as a very violent guy. He was, his brother said he was quick on the trigger, and another person that knew him said he wants to shoot everyone he sees. Now, it's interesting that they would focus on him because, again, that's not the way this bank was robbed. It was done in a very controlled, calm manner, and frankly, that doesn't sound like Roy Gann. Now, he had robbed banks before in Missouri, It was notorious. He had an unsavory reputation. He was under indictment for bank robbery, and he was sought for questioning in yet another bank robbery. So he was a person of interest. However, he was they were searching for him. They found him lolling about in the graveyard in Assumption. And the chief of police in Assumption went to take him in. For some reason thought he was just a vagrant, didn't frisk him. They got into a gun battle. The Assumption chief of police was shot once through both lungs. Mr. Gann was also shot, seriously wounded. He hijacked a car in Assumption, and he drove 65 miles to Staunton, stumbled into a bar and said, "I need help." And he did, because they took him to the hospital. The police found him there, and they confirmed he was in fact dying at that time. Now, they told him that, and he did what you would call a deathbed confession. The police came in. He apologized to two policemen he had shot earlier in his criminal career. He confessed to a number of things, including some things in Pana. He shot the Pana treasurer at that time and tried to hijack the car. He also robbed the Tex hardware store, and he wounded Cotton McGavick, who was a deputy at the time. So he was in the Pana area, but when State's Attorney Cole went to question him about the Pana bank robbery, he said, "I'd been around Pana. I had nothing to do with that robbery." Now, he had confessed to everything else. He confessed shooting people. He had confessed to other bank robberies. They specifically denied being involved in the Pana bank robbery. Now, maybe we do it less so today, but at that time, deathbed confessions were considered to be very reliable, because people were about to meet their maker and they wouldn't lie about something lying on their deathbed knowing they were dying. And in fact, he did die the next day. So if you put together his modus operandi, when he robbed banks, he was the go in with a gun and stick him up tight, and he did do that. And he was a violent guy. He was not calm by any stretch of the imagination. And his deathbed confession, I think, pretty much sealed it in the minds of the police. He did not rob the Pana First National Bank. So the police moved on, and there were a number of people that they looked at, the usual suspects. These were people in the Pana area that either because they were a tip or because of their reputation were questioned about the bank robbery, but all immediately released. Now, you can see who some of these people were. You can also tell that they didn't have an idea of who robbed the bank, because the state's attorney filed what's called John Doe indictments. Those are indictments that don't have anyone's real name on them. So they indicted John, Richard, George, and Henry Doe for having committed the crime. They may ask, why would they do that? And the answer is because that way they have a criminal case on file, and they could use a subpoena to try to get people to come in and talk to them. None of these people, the so-called usual suspects, none of those people were thought to have committed the crime. So they started to look in a larger geographical area to see who it could have been, and what they hit on was the Shelton gang. Now, I don't know if you know much about the Shelton gang, but they were probably the most feared and violent organized crime gang in southern Illinois. It started with three brothers. Because of Prohibition, they started bootlegging, they went into gambling, extortion, prostitution. They were basically vice-oriented people. You know, they weren't, well, they tried to rob a bank once and they immediately got caught. And because they went in with guns, told them, stick them up. And this was in Kincaid, Illinois, and it resulted in a shootout right in the middle of downtown Kincaid. one guy getting wounded, one of the robbers getting wounded. So it's, you know, basically a madcap operation. The Shelton gang was called the America's Bloodiest Gang. They were directly or indirectly responsible for 35 murders. They got into a turf war with Charlie Berger and his gang. He's another famous gangster from Southern Illinois. And they had some pretty wild gang warfare. There are two guys whose names are going to come up. One's Frank Wortman, and the other is Monroe Blackie Arms. Now, Blackie, he was a thug through and through, an expert shot with a Thompson machine gun. In fact, in one case, they found a body that had a lot of bullet holes in a small area, and because of that, they assumed Blackie Arms did it, because no one else could shoot a gun that well. He was a muscle man. He was a chauffeur, but he also was part of the muscle of the gang. If they needed something done violently, they would call on him. He was considered to be the leading assassin in the gang, which when you have a gang that did 35 murders, to be called the leading assassin is something of an accomplishment, dubious as it might be. But when Mr. Arms got the plans for a military tank from one of his relatives in Detroit, and he and a guy named Joe Adams built their own tank to attack Berger locations. That was one of his accomplishments. Now the Bergers built their own tank, and they had armored warfare in central and southern Illinois. He also made bombs, and he took nitroglycerin and wrapped 3 sticks of dynamite around nitroglycerin and formed it into bombs. He got a biplane to fly over one of the Berger residences and drop these things. It was the first and only example of a bombing with hostile intent in the history of the country. Never been done before. And Blackie Arms did it. Killed 2 dogs and a bird. So they withdrew when the anti-aircraft fire from the Berger gang drove them off. Now, Frank Buster Wortman, he was one of the members of the Shelton gang. Both Arms and Wortman joined the gang in 1926 in the height of the fighting with the Berger gang. Frank Wortman was not quite like Mr. Arms. He was not quite as violent, but he was found to be two-fisted. He was an enforcer. He would do any job that was assigned to him. And when the three Shelton brothers were arrested for bootlegging and sent to prison, he basically took over the Shelton gang. Blackie Arms was one of his leading associates. So those names, Arms and Wortman, became the focus of what the state police were looking at. Now, Mr. Arms had only been arrested once and convicted once. He served time in jail for for stealing a car. Mr. Wortman had been arrested 35 times for various crimes, but had not been convicted of a single crime. So, what happened was, Mr. Arms was under indictment for assaulting a federal agent. He was picked up and he was sent to the Shelbyville jail to be held there until he was to be tried for that crime in Springfield. While that happened, state investigators got wind of that, and they thought, maybe this is the guy, one of the guys that robbed the bank. So they went to Pana and they did what's called a photo lineup. Now, what it should be, there's ways it should be done. It should be, neutral pictures shown, nothing that would make one person stand out one way or another. It should be administered by someone who's not involved in the investigation, because they don't want the person showing them the pictures to hint that it's one person or another. We don't know how it was done, except it wasn't done by a neutral administrator. It was done by someone who thought that arms was involved. Now, interestingly enough, the state prosecutor also thought they were involved, but they thought Mr. Arms was the lookout and Mr. Wortman was the driver. The state investigators, though, went and they only showed the pictures to the bank employees. So the state investigators were thinking Arms and Wortman were in fact the inside robbers. They then took these people, the bank employees that had seen the robbers, took them to Shelbyville, pointed to Mr. Arms in his jail cell and said, "Is this the guy that did it?" And not surprisingly, the bank employees, they thought, well, they're only talking to the bank employees, and they brought us all the way over to Shelbyville to look at this guy, and he's standing in a jail cell. This must be one of the guys. And they said, yes, it was. Not to be done, though. Mr. Arms then was taken to Springfield for the federal trial. And he was on trial with Mr. Wortman for assaulting yet another federal agent. It was all involved with bootlegging. And they took the bank employees to Springfield and had them look in the glass door to the courtroom, see Mr. Arms and Mr. Wortman sitting at the defense table, and said, "Are these the guys that did it?" And not surprisingly, the bank employees said, "Well, they're only bringing bank employees up here, so they must be thinking this guy's an inside robber. And they wouldn't have driven us all the way to Springfield if they didn't think this was the guy." So they said, yeah, that's the guy. Now, today, those identifications would probably be thrown out of court because they were what were called show-ups. Now, a show-up is a legitimate police tool. If there's say there's a purse snatching and the policeman sees someone running and they grab this guy and take it to the victim and say, "Is this the guy that did it?" You know, they're doing it right there on the scene. They're grabbing someone and making sure that the perpetrator is not going to escape. If the person who was the victim says, "Yes, that's him," they take him to jail. If he said, "No, not," then he's gone. That's what a show-up is intended to be. What they should have done here is a lineup, and you've all seen lineups on TV where they have 6 guys standing across there. They all look basically the same. The one witness at a time says, "Yes, that's the guy," or "No, this is none of it." That's not nearly as suggestive, and they had plenty of time to do that, but for whatever reason, they did what they called show-ups. So, what you have, though, is you have a problem. You have the state investigators thinking that Wortman and Arms were the inside robbers, and you have the state prosecutor saying, no, they were the outside guys, the lookout and the driver. Well, that creates a problem. In fact, if I'm the defense counsel, I'm licking my lips on this because I know I can put the state investigators on the stand and say, "Do you think my client was the driver?" And they would say, "No." And they would say, "Do you think this guy was the lookout?" And they would say, "No." Because that's not what the witnesses had been, what the state investigators had been promoting as their theory of the case. So you have a very difficult situation here. You have 2 guys that were thugs. They were violent people, but they were involved in vice crimes. Now, vice crimes, if you do that, you don't want to be in the spotlight. You want to be kept in the shadows, because as soon as you are out in the open, then people get mad about the vice. You just don't operate as well. So these guys were vice criminals. They were making a lot of money. There are estimates that the Shelton gang during this time was bringing in about $2 million a year in revenue. Now, you have to ask yourself, if you are bringing in $2 million a year, why would you go and steal $27,000 out in public with the risk of being seen, shot, arrested, unsuccessful? doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't fit the kind of criminal they were. They were clearly criminals, but it doesn't fit the kind of criminals they were. Plus, the Pana Bank robbery was done with precision. It was carefully planned, carefully carried out, well executed, and the fact that they had left no physical evidence whatsoever is a testimony to how professional they were. Arms and Wortman were not bank robbers. They had no experience robbing banks. They had experience gambling. They had experience extorting people. They had experience beating people up. Mr. Arms was under suspicion of murdering a witness. So, I mean, they knew how to do some things quite well, but they didn't know how to rob banks. What they tried to do then is they tried to bring a guy in called Johnny Dressed Up Gardner and tried to say he was the guy that provided the expertise. Yeah, that's a little ahead of us there. That's right. So they tried to bring in Johnny Gardner. Johnny Gardner was a bank robber, no doubt about that. But when they brought him down to the witnesses, because they thought he might have been one of the inside robbers, they brought him down, and Payne employees said, no, that's not the guy. That's not the guy that robbed the bank. So the investigator said, well, okay, if he wasn't the inside guy, maybe he was one of the planners of the robbery, because they thought the four criminals that robbed the bank and Gardner met the night before. Maybe Gardner is the source of the plan. Well, to do that, he would have had to be in Pana, and he would have had to look at the bank. He would have had to study the bank, and he had never done that. He wasn't the inside robber at all. He wasn't the planner at all. So what happened? Well, Mr. Arms and Mr. Wortman were indicted for the crime. However, they were never tried for the crime. And why is that? Well, I think the easy answer to that is because the prosecutor understood he probably did not have enough evidence to win the case, and that he had a conflict between him and the investigators as to what Arms and Wortman did, so they never tried the case. I think he put it on hold, thinking maybe evidence will show up, and if it does, then I can prosecute the case, or if after a few years nothing further shows up, I'll quietly let it die. And in fact, that's what it did. He put a hold on them. They'd been convicted in Springfield of the assault charges, and they were in federal prison. But he put a hold on them, so if they were released, they would not just be released out to the open. Christian County would be notified, and they'd be brought back to Christian County. He took that hold off in 1937. That's the indication, his final surrender, that he could not try the case. So, that's what we have. Now let's ask our jury if they have any questions. Or if you don't, it's okay too.
Dillinger had a one?
Dillinger had been shot on March 31st when he escaped from a place in Minnesota that had been raided. He'd been shot through the left thigh. Bone wasn't hit, but it was a through-and-through wound in his left thigh. We know that because the autopsy of Dillinger, performed on July 22nd, showed that he had a scar on his left thigh with a through bullet wound. Now, if you look at the medical sources, they would say if he was shot on the 31st, he would definitely have a limp on April 19th. Now, the state prosecutor, who thought Arms was the lookout, said Arms faked the limp. Now, you know, there's something called Occam's razor that says the most simple explanation is usually the right one. To say that Tony Arms, who wasn't really known for thinking things out, would think of having a limp to look like Dillinger doesn't sound like Monroe Arms. Also, why would you draw that kind of attention to yourself? The lookout wants to be invisible. He wants to blend into the scenery. But by having a limp, he becomes more noticeable. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to say that Monroe Arms faked the limp. Any other questions from juries? Or anyone else for that matter? If you have any questions, other than not being able to hear me, Any other questions about what happened here? And we'll let our jury decide. I don't want to say what I will give you as my theory until the jury's decided. Yes?
I got a question. The Smith's man that was a janitor,
Yes.
like, he was the first one that was accosted by.
Yes, he was first accosted in the alley. He was standing on a ladder watching the
Right,
road.
there was two men?
The two men, yep.
Okay, did he give, like, I would think that he would be able to give a.
He was the person that should have had the best ability to identify the two inside robbers.
Right.
He never saw the lookout, never saw the driver, but he saw those two guys. They walked into the bank, locked the bank, took him along, sat him down,
Right.
conversed with him. And the answer is they showed him pictures and he could not identify who from the pictures.
Okay, so then, the jewelry store man,
Yes.
I mean, could it be possible that he wanted to inflate the situation and say it was Dillinger?
Well,
I mean,
You know,
it happened
that's-
back then, same as it does today.
that's a good question because, the human mind will often have a preconceived notion of what it's watching and it looks for the things that support what their idea is. They had been talking about bank robberies before, him and his employee, Kuhn, before the car had ever pulled up in front. By coincidence, they were talking about bank robberies and whether or not that would happen in Pana, and lo and behold, it happened right in front of them. So the answer to that is, they didn't really know a robbery was taking place to the very last minute when everybody was piling into the car backs up and takes off. So the only person that really saw the lookout was Butterfield. He told the police the guy had a distinct limp and he thought it was Dillinger. They showed him the pictures and he said, yes, that's the guy I saw. And the police didn't believe him. Now, maybe he said other things that were contradictory. Maybe they thought, as you thought, he just kind of wanted to believe it was Dillinger. I can't tell you why they didn't believe him, but all they believed was the lookout had a limp. Which, to me, if you're not going to believe him about it being Dillinger, the fact that he then said the guy had a limp, did he really? Or was he just thinking the guy walked funny? Maybe he had a funny gait.
The two garbage, or the one garbage man, right? There was one?
Yeah,
Couldn't he identify the two that were in the car?
no. Well, they mistakenly identified that as
Because the sun would have been in the cars
Yes.
shining in the
Well,
window.
and you're right, absolutely right about that. It was, at that time, it was about 8:10 in the
Right.
morning, the sun was coming up, and it may have lit up the interior of that car, or on the other hand, it might have caused glare. But they mistakenly identified them as two people they know. So, you kind of look at them and say, well, how sure are you of their identification if at first they thought it was someone totally different? They, again, were probably shown pictures and they didn't identify anyone in the car. Yes?
So back then, didn't they do sketches based on witnesses' descriptions? Like do artist rendering kind of deal?
I can't answer that question. I don't know. There's no report that they did that. So whether they did or not, I can't say. But if there was, none survived. And you would think if there were any that survived, it would have been in the paper. There were none.
And why weren't your files, when you went to look for them, you and your wife, you didn't find any, had there been fires and storage, do you have any information?
I can only speculate on that. What happened was Illinois created what they call the Illinois, what's it called, IDAC. It's for a depository where all counties can send their records, their old records. We first went to the state archives because that was one place they could be, and we had two archivists look all afternoon and they could find nothing. To their surprise, they thought they would have something, but there was nothing. In fact, there was nothing from Taylorville at all. We went to Sangamon, well, I call it Sangamon State, that's where Rick and I went, but University of Illinois Springfield, and checked the repository there for all county records within the county served by University of Illinois Springfield. They had no records at all from Taylorville. You know, one possibility is because the case had never been tried, it was, you know, kind of a dead case at that point. I would have guessed if it had Dillinger's name on it, they would have kept it, but it didn't have Dillinger's name on it. It had Arms and Workman, and Arms and Workman, you know, were never tried. You know, I have to add just one anecdote to that. At that time, there were city courts, and Pana had a city court, and that court could try any felony case. This is not really germane, but it's kind of interesting. The county prosecutor dismissed the charges in Taylorville, and then he rebrought the charges in Pana. You could ask why he did that. He might have thought, I'll get a better jury in Pana if I ever do try this case. Or he thought, maybe more out of the way if it's in Pana. But we never found any records of the Pana City Court either. It could have been tried in either place. He chose first to do it in Taylorville, then changed to Pana, and it was not found. Nothing was found. So the only thing we could really rely on are books. If you look at the books and you do a Google search, you will find that the Pana bank robbery was not attributed to John Dillinger. People didn't think it was John Dillinger, and the reason was because he was, you know, dismissed as absurd as the perpetrator by the state police, basically the day of the robbery.
The last question I have is, how would the bank robbers, like, I understand how we know how much money they had back then because, you know, you can trace the records and whatnot, but how did the general public back in 1934 know how much money was in that bank? Because,
well,
you know, how would you could probably go and, like, maybe not.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to answer that after I get the jury's decision.
Okay.
You have to pick 4, 3, 2, 1, or none. And our bailiff will collect the answers, and we'll see what the jury has to say. Yes.
Because he was one of the 3 that were indicted.
He was indicted. He was also arrested right after the indictment, spent 2 or 3 days in jail, and then he was released. And when the case was refiled in Pana, he was not included. Only Arms were indicted. So what the prosecutor said is, basically, I think he was involved, but I can't prove it. So, you know, it's...
Ma'am, did you have a question?
Yeah, I don't think they had the FDIC back then, and since it was a depression, who was technically out the money? I mean, was it reimbursed somehow to the bank by the government in any way, shape, or form, or were just people from paying out that money?
Well, at that time, before, I think it was 1930, the bank would just be out the money. But they came up with federal deposit insurance as part of the collapse of banks that happened during bank runs in the early 1930s. That's what destroyed the Schuyler Bank. That's what destroyed the Pana National Bank in 1930. But, you know, they might have enough money or enough assets to cover what was going on, but they didn't have the cash on hand when people started coming into the bank. So the answer is basically the government would cover the loss. They were also a member of the, I can't remember what it's called, the Illinois Bankers Association, and they were also involved. And they may have had some insurance through that. But I don't believe the bank was out the money.
So prior to that, when the banks collapsed, the people were just out, just like what created the depression. The people were just broke. They just lost their money prior to that. Like when the other 2 banks closed and paid.
Before 1930,
Yeah.
The bank, well, you know, the bank would have to make do the loss.
Yeah.
Or if they couldn't, then the
close,
bank
yeah.
would go in.
Is this First National Bank that got robbed, is that the grandfather of what we have now in Pana?
I think it's the same bank.
Same one, okay.
Yeah. So I've got these years.
No,
I'm sorry. I need to get a different microphone. This was heavy in my arm. So just do that if you want to hear me better. Yes.
In my criminal mind, I'm thinking, you know, if Dylan was accused of all these bank robberies, I would fake a limp out in public for people to think that it was Dylan. Just a thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly what the state's attorney thought was happening. They thought Arms faked the limp. I just, by Arms' personality and by, I mean, first of all people to have standing on a street corner, he's kind of a violent, temperamental kind of guy to be standing there. I mean, if he got into an argument for loitering on the streets, he might shoot them. I mean, he's that kind of guy. It doesn't really match his, if you want to call them, criminal skills. But, you know, again, the state's attorney agrees with what you're saying, that he faked the limp.
John, that picture in the paper that you showed of all of the bank employees and the bank manager, they were all smiling. I think it was an inside job.
Well, you know, the only one I wonder about is Rick's father, but you know, all I can say is they're
celebrities, aren't
they were, and Judy knows this better than I do. I think all of the women were young, weren't they? Yeah, they were all fairly young. They were all Pana residents.
happy they weren't killed?
Well, you know, they did have guns, and I mean, there had certainly been violent bank robberies that had happened in the not too distant past. So, if anything went wrong, you know, these guys would shoot, and you know, who knows would get in the way. I just, you know, they also worked at the bank for some period of time afterwards. So all of these people stayed at Pana. You'd think if they had their share of $600,000, they would probably go to the Bahamas or something. But they didn't. They all stayed in Pana. So I guess those of us with a conspiratorial type of view of things might think that, but I would say there's no evidence to think that any of these people were involved.
Was that picture taken right after?
Yes, it was. That was in the paper, I think, the day after. Yeah, I mean, I think, if you look at her, she's kind of like, so, yeah, they certainly were celebrities, I mean, in Pana, that's certainly. I would say they were probably scared to death. I don't, you know, I think maybe what you're seeing here are some people that were quite relieved to have survived a very dangerous situation. Do we have the results from the jurors?
We give it a miss, Rick's our foreman.
Okay, Rick's the foreman. Tell us what you think.
A unanimous decision, none of the above.
Oh. Okay, now let's move on then, and I'm going to tell you, the police almost immediately dismissed Dillinger. And what I'm going to say is, I can't tell you that John Dillinger robbed that bank. What I can tell you is, it's much more plausible that he did it or was involved in it than certainly the police assessment of it being absurd. So, I'm going to reconstruct for you the possible way that Dillinger was involved based on what we know about Dillinger. And then maybe one of the keys to this is he had a limp and his whereabouts are unaccounted for during this period of time. Now, he robbed a bank on March 13th and had gotten a lot of money. He was going to participate in a meeting of his gang at Little Bohemia Lodge in Upper Wisconsin, and he did appear at that on the 20th. But there is a period of time where he is unaccounted for. So let's take a look at that. The first is, let's see if we can go on here. More. Keep going. Well, that's too far. Let's go back. Number 2, Was John Dillinger the real robber of the Pana Bank? So that's the first question we have. Okay, next one. Got it. Okay, so first, and this addresses the question that was asked, why Pana First National Bank? Why would it be targeted by John Dillinger as a possible place to rob a bank? He tended to rob banks in smaller towns. If you look at the bank, he had spent April 5th through April 8th at his father's house in Mooresville, Indiana. That's outside of Indianapolis. He was there, he had a limp. His father said, yeah, he had a limp. So while he was there, okay, again, this is not what happened, this is a plausible theory of what happened. While he was there, he heard about the Pana First National Bank. It met a lot of the criteria that would be good to use to rob a bank. It was a small town. That means it had a small police force. It was not surrounded by any big towns where there could immediately be police reinforcement. Because it was the only bank in town, that's where all of the business, or probably the vast majority of business, was conducted, banking business. And maybe most significantly, it was a coal mining town, and the payday for the coal miners was on a Friday. So they would want to have enough cash on hand the day before so that when the miners were paid and came in to cash their checks, because that's how they're being paid at that time, the bank would have enough cash on hand to pay out the payment of the checks. So robbing the Pana First National Bank on a Thursday makes sense because it's the only bank in town. There's a lot of business transacted there. There's a lot of cash on hand. And in fact, there was $75,000 on hand, which is obviously a lot of money. So it was there. It had a good road network around it. They could, as you, well, not yet, but as you'll see, there are a lot of places they could go, ditch their car, change cars, and head off in a different direction without it ever being known. So on April 13th, Dillinger was involved in what I think is one of his more interesting crimes. He and a guy by the name of Van Meter robbed the Warsaw, Indiana arsenal and stole pistols and bulletproof vests from there. Now, you have to ask yourself, why would you do that? I mean, those are tools of the trade when it comes to bank robbery, but it's kind of bold to rob a police station. So I'm speculating that he had been shot and he still had a limp. He thought, I'll use a bulletproof vest because people are taking shots at me now. He was there, one of his closest friends, go down, up a few, I should say. That John Hamilton. This is John Hamilton. He was a member of the original Dillinger gang. He was probably John Dillinger's closest friend, and he was his closest and most trusted associate. Now, he would end up getting killed only a couple weeks later. But at that time, he and Dillinger identified 2 other robbers to help with this. 2 other experienced robbers that were in the area that he knew, at least by reputation, maybe he actually knew them. The rest of his gang was up north at the time, so he found 2 other guys to be the inside robbers. He knew, he would normally have gone inside the bank. That was Dillinger's style. You know, he was going to be the inside guy. But he realized he had been shot He realized he had limited mobility. He realized if any of the bank employees gave him a hard time, he might struggle with fighting them because he was still limping, weak in that leg, and experiencing pain. So he at that time said, okay, John Hamilton will be the driver because I trust him, and I got to make sure that the driver doesn't take out without me. And he said, I'll be the lookout. Now, you think, what's the lookout do? The lookout's one of the most important people in the robbery, the way these things are being staged, because he was the guy standing outside the bank looking for anything that threatened the guys inside the bank that would cause the police to come, the police coming. He was the guy that would make the important decision to get everyone out of the bank, get them in the car, and get out of town. And that fits Dillinger's personality. And that he was a leader, and he would do that kind of thing. So, the story, there is a report that Hamilton and Dillinger were together visiting Hamilton's sister in Upper Michigan. Now, this came from an informant. Informants are often reliable. The police actually raided the sister's house. Dillinger wasn't there, and of course, the sister said he was never here. The police thought, well, maybe we will arrest her for being an accomplice, aiding and abetting, as it's called. But they never brought charges because they couldn't prove that Dillinger was there or not. But let's assume for the moment Hamilton and Dillinger were there. By April 18th, if they drove all night, they could have been in Taylorville quite easily. There, they met the two other robbers that had been scouting the Pana Bank for the last few days. They met in Taylorville. They discussed the robbery. They were all four professionals. They all were adherents to the Lamb technique of robbing banks. They stayed overnight there. Now, one other thing about the lookout, he was described as being unkempt. Dillinger was not the kind of person to look unkempt. But if he and Hamilton had driven all night from Upper Michigan and then spent the next night sleeping in a car in Taylorville, he might have looked a little bit worse for wear and looked unkempt. So the Pana Scouts and Hamilton and Dillinger meet, discuss, they get ready to do the robbery the next day. So they're doing staging. Do the next one. Down. Over. It's number 2. Number 38. Okay, so that morning you have two cars. You have a Chevrolet and you have a Pontiac. You have the Pontiac. The Pontiac is seen at Charlie Kirkpatrick's gas station at about 7 o'clock. A new Chevrolet is seen outside of the West Cemetery at about the same time. 7:05, they filled up the car with gas, they head out to the West Cemetery, and they pick up the other two guys. The Chevrolet's probably parked out there somewhere, out of the way, maybe in the cemetery itself. Okay, next slide, please. So the secondary visit is out there somewhere. It's seen, there's a person standing outside the car, pacing around, looks nervous. That might be Hamilton. They're identified. And was Dillinger in the car? Maybe he was. Maybe he's still asleep in the back seat. Next slide, please. Okay, so the four of them are now in the same car. They drive into Pana. Supposedly, they sit outside the A&P grocery store, which is on 3rd and Oak Street, if you remember where that was at. There's a grocery store there when I was growing up. It was seen sitting outside that. And the four people are sitting there, they're waiting for Rick's grandfather to get the window washing done in the front of the bank so that he goes outside and down the alley. The car pulls up there at about 7:45. They accost Mr. Schmitz and they take him to the back. They go in, rob the bank, do their thing inside there, collect all the money. Mr. Dillinger, meantime, has limped across the street. He's standing watch outside the Central Bank. Mr. Hamilton's inside the car. It's all time. They know the bank doors, the vault door is supposed to open at 8, and the inside robbers have 10 minutes then to do everything they're going to do to clear out as much money as they can, and that's what they do. I call it a near perfect crime because, well, for one reason, it was never solved. So that makes it a pretty good crime by any standard of association. So at that point, they have robbed the bank. They've got all the money in the bank. They take off to the West Cemetery, and they start there. Why were all these different cars seen going in different directions? Well, there's a lot of talk about people speeding and seeing speeding cars. I think that what happened was, possibly, that the two inside guys took the Pontiac and drove it further. They were the ones that stole the car originally. They took it down somewhere further, dumped it, had another car stashed and ready to go. They got in that car and took off. In the meantime, Hamilton and Dillinger were in the Chevrolet that's never been identified with the bank. They take off. Mr. Dillinger, I think, was probably going north because he was scheduled to appear. He was scheduled to appear here in Little Bohemia Lodge, and in fact, Dillinger and Hamilton showed up on April 20th, that's the Friday, at 5:30 p.m. Plenty of time for them to get to the lodge. So there's that gap of time when he wasn't known to be anywhere, but he could have been in Pana and could have been robbing the bank. Now, do I think it was Dillinger? I can't say it was Dillinger. No one can say it's Dillinger. It's too long removed, investigative files are gone. But for the state police to have said the day of the bank robbery it was absurd was a premature and I think incorrect assessment of what the situation was. If they would have looked at this, I mean, Dillinger wasn't caught until he was shot and killed on July 22nd, so could they have questioned him? Probably not. They could have captured him. But they could have looked more closely at the possibility that he committed the crime, because the guys they said committed the crime, they never tried. So that's kind of the story that went along. First time we done it. Sorry about that. Any questions? Anyone want to challenge that theory?
My last question is why couldn't they never trace serial numbers? It just, they weren't very good at it back then, or?
The serial numbers?
Yeah, you said they never traced any of the
You
money.
mean like today, money is usually, they have it known in serial numbers. They have it known in serial numbers. I could do this too, because this doesn't work. Yes, but back then, if it was done, there was no mention of that whatsoever. The only thing that was said is the money was never recovered. So if there was any kind of accounting by serial numbers, it never showed up. The money never showed up anywhere. So, anyone want to vote for Dillinger? There were two.
I can't see him as a lookout. I could see him inside the bank, but not as a lookout.
Yes, and that's a very valid point. And I would say, now there was one example, he robbed a bank in January where he was not inside the bank. So it did happen occasionally that he wouldn't have been. I think in almost all circumstances he would have been if he would have been able. But he was a very smart guy. I mean, assessments were, he had the intelligence of like an upper level professional type person today. So he was a smart guy. He knew his limitations, and he might have just thought, I want to rob the bank, but I don't know if I'm able to be inside the bank, because if things went wrong, could he have gotten out with a bad leg? It would have slowed him down. So, I mean, yes, that's a valid point. I mean, under normal circumstances, he would have been inside the bank, but these weren't normal circumstances. Any other questions? Yes.
Was it widely known that he had a limp, or was that recent enough that people wanted to know?
I would say it had been reported earlier because, you know, he showed up in Mooresville, Indiana to visit his family. There's a family reunion on the 8th.
I mean, was the general public aware?
Well, you know, the police were there. The police staked out the joint, as they say, but they never arrested him. And like, they got a lot of criticism for that because they were like, well, why didn't you arrest him? But at that time, Dillinger's father said he had a limp. So the answer to your question is yes, it was reported. So it is possible Butterfield knew that when he saw the limp. And because of that, said, I see a lookout, he's limping. I think that was Dillinger. So, I mean, yes, that's a valid point and a valid criticism of Butterfield. But on the other hand, if he thought it was Butterfield thought it was Dillinger to begin with, you know, yeah, I mean, he was predisposed to think it was Dillinger, or it was Dillinger, and he was reporting accurately what he saw.
Very interesting.